The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was no ordinary path. It was a treacherous stretch of about 17 miles, winding through rocky cliffs, deep valleys, and barren lands where shadows stretched long in the midday sun. It was infamous for its dangers. Travelers feared the lurking presence of bandits, who often hid behind boulders, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to pass. It was known as the Way of Blood because of the many lives lost to robbery and violence. Ezra, a merchant from Jerusalem, had heard all these warnings before but had little choice but to take this road. He had urgent business in Jericho, where he intended to trade fine linen and spices. The profits from this trip would provide for his household, and despite the risks, he knew the journey had to be made. With a small satchel of goods slung over his shoulder and a pouch of coins hidden beneath his tunic, Ezra set out at dawn. The sun was already high when he reached the narrowest stretch of the road, a place where travelers were most vulnerable. The cliffs on either side loomed over him, casting deep shadows despite the heat. He quickened his pace, glancing from side to side, his heart thudding in his chest. Then, out of the silence, came a sound, a rustling from behind the rocks. Before Ezra could react, a group of men leaped out, their faces wrapped in cloth to conceal their identities. They carried clubs and daggers, their eyes filled with greed and menace. "Hold him down," one of the bandits barked. Ezra struggled, but he was only one man against many. A fist slammed into his stomach, knocking the wind from his lungs. He crumpled to the ground, gasping, while rough hands searched his garments. His coins were yanked from their hiding place, his satchel torn from his grip. One of the men ripped his cloak away, leaving him exposed to the blistering sun. "Please," Ezra croaked, his vision swimming. "Take what you want, but let me go." The leader of the bandits sneered. "We can't have you running to the Roman guards, can we?" He raised his club. Ezra barely had time to brace himself before the first blow struck his ribs. Pain exploded through his body. Another hit followed, then another. His world darkened as the beating continued, his cries fading into the vast emptiness of the desert. When the bandits were satisfied, they left him there, half naked, bleeding, and barely clinging to life. The sun burned overhead, and the winds carried only the sound of his ragged breathing. Hours passed. Ezra drifted in and out of consciousness, the taste of dust and blood thick in his mouth. He did not know how long he had been lying there when he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Through swollen eyes, he glimpsed a figure in fine robes, a priest from the temple in Jerusalem. Ezra's heart stirred with hope. Surely, a servant of God would not leave him in such a state. The priest saw him. He stopped briefly, his gaze falling upon the battered form on the ground. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then, he turned away. Ezra tried to speak, but no words came. The priest hurried past him, averting his eyes as if pretending not to see. Perhaps he feared defilement from touching a possibly dead body. Perhaps he did not wish to involve himself in the misfortunes of others. Whatever his reason, he vanished down the road, leaving Ezra to his suffering. More time passed. The sun had begun its descent when another traveler appeared, a Levite, a man who served in the temple. Ezra's spirit flickered with the last embers of hope. But the Levite, too, hesitated. He took a cautious step closer, peering at the broken man. Ezra met his gaze, silently pleading. Yet, like the priest before him, the Levite chose the safer path. He shook his head, whispered a prayer under his breath, and continued on his way. Ezra was alone once more. His hope, his strength, his will to live, everything was slipping away. Then, in the fading light of evening, the sound of hooves against the dirt reached his ears. Another traveler. But this one was different. A Samaritan. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate road. A warm breeze carried the scent of dust and distant olive groves, whispering through the jagged rocks that lined the path. Hoofbeats echoed softly against the ground, steady and unhurried. The traveler was a Samaritan, a man accustomed to wary glances and hushed whispers whenever he passed through Jewish lands. His people and the Jews had been at odds for centuries, their animosity woven deep into the fabric of their histories. Yet, he had business in Jericho, and the road through Jerusalem was the most direct route. He rode a sturdy donkey, its saddle laden with supplies, water skins, a bundle of cloth, and small containers of oil and wine. He had planned to reach Jericho before nightfall, but something on the roadside caught his eye. A body, unmoving, lay in the dust. The Samaritan pulled on the reins, bringing his donkey to a halt. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. This road was notorious for ambushes, and stopping could mean putting himself at risk. But something about the way the man lay there, half naked, bruised, barely breathing, stirred something within him. He dismounted cautiously, his sandals crunching against the gravel. As he approached, he saw the man's face, swollen and bloodied, barely recognizable. He was a Jew, a man whose people despised his own. The safer choice would be to leave him and continue on his way. Surely, another of his kin would come along to help. And yet, the Samaritan did not move away. Instead, he knelt beside the man. "Can you hear me?" he asked gently, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. A faint groan escaped the injured man's lips. He was alive, but only barely. The Samaritan frowned, his heart tightening. He had seen men die before, and if he did not act quickly, this one would not last the night. From his saddle, he retrieved a flask of water and carefully tilted it against the man's lips. "Drink," he murmured. The man's cracked lips parted, and he took in the water greedily before falling back into unconsciousness. The Samaritan worked swiftly. He tore a strip of linen from his own robe and poured wine over it, using the alcohol to clean the man's wounds. The injured man flinched but did not wake. Next, he applied oil, soothing the raw edges of torn skin. His hands moved with practiced care. He had tended to wounded animals and fallen travelers before, but never had he nursed one who might have spit at his feet on any other day. When the worst of the bleeding was tended to, the Samaritan faced another problem. The man could not walk, nor could he be left behind. With a soft sigh, he bent down and lifted the injured man onto his donkey, securing him carefully. It would slow his journey, but the decision had already been made. Leading the donkey by the reins, the Samaritan continued down the road, the weight of the unconscious man pressing against his conscience as much as his saddle. The town of Jericho was still a few miles away when night fully descended. The road, already treacherous, became even more dangerous in the dark. The Samaritan's thoughts flickered between concern for his own safety and the condition of the man he carried. At last, distant lights flickered on the horizon, the glow of an inn, a place of rest and respite for weary travelers. Relief flooded through the Samaritan as he quickened his pace. Reaching the inn's modest stable, he carefully eased the injured man off the donkey. His arms ached, but he ignored his discomfort. Pushing open the creaking wooden door, he stepped inside, where the warm glow of lanterns revealed a bearded innkeeper polishing a set of wooden cups. The innkeeper looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight before him. "What happened?" "I found him on the road," the Samaritan explained. "Beaten and left for dead." The innkeeper grunted. "Robbers, no doubt. They've been worse this season." He eyed the Samaritan warily. "And you, stranger? You don't look like a Jew." "I am not," the Samaritan replied evenly, expecting resistance. "But I need a room for him." "I will pay." The innkeeper's eyebrows lifted at that. "Humph, coin is coin. Bring him upstairs." With effort, the Samaritan carried the man inside and laid him on a modest cot. The innkeeper provided fresh bandages and a warm broth, and the Samaritan stayed by the man's side, watching over him through the night. As dawn broke, he reached into his pouch and placed 2 silver denarii on the table before the innkeeper. "This should cover his care. If more is needed, I will repay you when I return." The innkeeper studied him for a long moment before nodding. You're a rare kind, stranger. The Samaritan did not answer. He simply turned back to the road, disappearing into the early morning light. The morning light streamed through the wooden shutters, painting golden patterns on the walls of the modest inn room. The injured man stirred, his body aching, his head throbbing with pain. He struggled to open his swollen eyes, his mind clouded with confusion. Where was he? The last thing he remembered was the attack, the bandits' cruel laughter, the searing pain, and the sense of helplessness as darkness swallowed him whole. His fingers weakly grasped the rough linen sheets beneath him. Someone had tended to his wounds, cleaned his cuts, and provided him shelter. But who? The door creaked open, and the innkeeper stepped inside, carrying a bowl of warm broth. Awake, are you? The man tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The innkeeper helped him sit up and pressed the bowl into his hands. Drink. You've been out for a full day. He drank slowly, the warmth spreading through his body. Who brought me here? He rasped. The innkeeper scoffed. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. A Samaritan. The injured man froze, disbelief flickering in his eyes. A Samaritan? I found you half dead on the road and brought you here. Paid for your stay too. The man's mind reeled. A Samaritan, the very people he had been taught to despise, had shown him mercy. Shame and gratitude warred within him. How could it be that the one he least expected to help had saved his life? He leaned back against the pillows, lost in thought. Perhaps everything he had believed about his enemies was wrong. Perhaps kindness knew no borders. And perhaps he had much to learn. The injured man awoke to the rhythmic creaking of the wooden walls and the scent of herbs wafting through the air. As he slowly regained consciousness, he struggled to recall what had happened to him. Memories of the attack rushed back, the brutality of the bandits, the helplessness, and then, a hazy recollection of someone caring for him. He attempted to sit up, his ribs protesting with sharp pain. The innkeeper entered the room, setting down a small bowl of porridge. Easy now, the older man said. You've been through quite an ordeal. The injured man winced but managed a hoarse whisper. A Samaritan. A surge of confusion and shame washed over him. He had been raised to distress Samaritans, yet one had saved his life. The weight of gratitude pressed on his chest, heavier than his wounds. He had been helpless, and an enemy had shown him mercy when his own people had passed him by. His hands trembled as he grasped the wooden spoon, stirring the porridge absent-mindedly. Where is he now? The innkeeper shrugged. Gone. Left before dawn. Paid for your stay, said he'd check on you if you returned this way. A lump formed in the injured man's throat. How could he repay such kindness? As days passed, his strength returned, but so did his questions. Why had the Samaritan helped him? What kind of man was he? The weight of his gratitude grew, intertwining with an unfamiliar sense of humility. He made a decision: he would find the Samaritan. Not just to thank him, but to understand him. With the innkeeper's help, he gathered what little he had and prepared for the journey. As he set out, he realized that his path was no longer just about reaching his original destination. It was a journey of redemption, a chance to challenge his own prejudices and seek a new understanding of what it meant to love one's neighbor. He took a deep breath, steeled his resolve, and walked forward, hoping to find the man who had saved his life. The journey to find the Samaritan was not merely one of distance, but one of purpose. The injured man, now stronger and steadier, felt the weight of his newfound perspective settle upon him. He had always believed that kindness was reserved for one's own people, that mercy had its limits. And yet, a Samaritan, a man he had been raised to see as an enemy, had shattered that belief with a simple act of compassion. As he departed from the inn, his steps were measured but determined. He asked the innkeeper if he had any knowledge of where the Samaritan might have gone. The older man shrugged. He mentioned business in Jericho, but beyond that, I cannot say." The road stretched before him, winding and uncertain. Yet, he knew he had to follow it. He passed weary travelers, merchants leading laden carts, Roman soldiers patrolling the trade routes. Each step forward was a step away from his old prejudices. At a crossroads, he encountered a group of Jewish men who eyed him warily. They asked where he was headed, and he told them he sought a Samaritan. Their laughter was bitter. "A Samaritan? Why would you seek one of them?" He hesitated before answering. "Because he saved my life." Their skepticism was palpable, but he no longer cared. The truth was its own justification. Days passed, and his journey took him through villages and open fields. He asked travelers and innkeepers, always describing the Samaritan who had shown him kindness. Slowly, the pieces of a trail emerged, sightings in Jericho, a caravan he had joined, whispers of a merchant dealing in oils and wine. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, he found himself in a small village on the outskirts of Jericho. There, outside a modest home, a familiar donkey was tethered. His heart pounded. He stepped forward, knocking softly on the wooden door. It creaked open, and before him stood the man he had been searching for, the Samaritan. Their eyes met, recognition dawning between them. The injured man, now healed, bowed his head slightly. "I have come to thank you." The Samaritan regarded him with quiet understanding. "Come inside," he said. "We have much to talk about." As the injured man stepped inside the Samaritan's modest home, he was immediately struck by its simplicity. The room smelled of aged wood and faint traces of oil, and the flickering glow of a lantern cast warm light over a small table set with humble dishes. The Samaritan gestured for him to sit, and he did so, still uncertain of what to say. "I never expected to see you again," the Samaritan said, pouring water into a clay cup and placing it before his guest. "I never expected to look for you," the man admitted. "And yet, here I am." Silence settled between them as they studied one another. Then, the injured man, who now thought of himself simply as a traveler, sighed. "My whole life, I believed that kindness was reserved for my own people. That mercy had limits. You shattered that belief." The Samaritan gave a small nod but said nothing, allowing the man to continue. "I have walked miles to find you, and not just to offer my gratitude," the traveler confessed. "I needed to understand why you did it. Why help a man who would not have done the same for you?" The Samaritan leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Because kindness is not about who deserves it," he said simply. "It is about who needs it." The traveler absorbed those words, feeling the weight of them settle into his soul. "Then I was a fool," he murmured. "I spent years believing in divisions that do not matter. You taught me otherwise." The Samaritan smiled, a quiet, knowing expression. "Then perhaps your journey was not just to find me, but to find yourself." That night, they spoke of many things, of their homes, their families, the unspoken rules that had dictated their lives. And as the traveler listened, he realized that the man before him was not an enemy, but a brother in humanity. Dawn arrived with golden light spilling over the hills. The traveler stood, knowing he had to return home, but he was no longer the same man who had left it. He clasped the Samaritan's hand, feeling true kinship for the first time. "I will tell others of what you have done," he promised. "Perhaps, one day, they will understand as I do now." The Samaritan nodded. "And perhaps, one day, the divisions between us will no longer matter." As the traveler walked away, he felt lighter, freer. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, he was not walking it alone. As the traveler made his way back home, the road felt different beneath his feet. The same dust clung to his sandals, the same sun blazed overhead, and yet he himself was not the same man who had once walked this path. He carried within him the weight of an experience that had reshaped his view of the world. When he reached his village, familiar faces greeted him, but he saw them now with new eyes. He thought of the priests who had passed him by on the road, the Levite who had ignored his suffering. He had once believed in the divisions between his people and the Samaritans, but now he questioned them. His family rejoiced at his return, but they were puzzled by his quiet demeanor. His father, a man of tradition and unwavering belief, noticed the change most of all. "What troubles you, my son?" his father asked one evening as they sat outside beneath the stars. The traveler hesitated, then spoke. "I was saved by a Samaritan." His father stiffened. "A Samaritan?" "Yes," the traveler continued. "He found me dying on the roadside. He had no reason to help me, and yet he did. He bandaged my wounds, carried me to safety, and paid for my care." His father's expression darkened. "You speak as if this is a good thing." The traveler met his father. As the traveler stood before his father, the weight of his journey and the lessons he had learned pressed heavily upon him. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken questions and the tension of old beliefs clashing with newfound truths. "Father," the traveler began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I once believed as you do, that Samaritans were our enemies, that kindness should be reserved for our own. But I was wrong. The man who saved me, a Samaritan, showed me that compassion knows no boundaries. He saw me not as a Jew, but as a fellow human being in need. And in that moment, he became my brother." His father's face softened, though his eyes still held doubt. "You speak of things that challenge everything we have been taught," he said slowly. "It is not easy to let go of the past." "No," the traveler agreed. "It is not easy. But it is necessary. If we hold on to hatred and division, we will never truly see one another. We will never understand what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves." The old man sighed, his gaze drifting to the stars above. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted after a long pause. "Perhaps it is time to question what we have always believed." The traveler smiled, a sense of hope swelling within him. "Then let us begin here, in our own home. Let us teach others what I have learned, that mercy is greater than tradition, that love is stronger than hate." Over the following weeks, the traveler shared his story with anyone who would listen. Some dismissed him, clinging to their prejudices, but others were moved by his words. Slowly, the seeds of change began to take root in the village. The story of the Good Samaritan spread, not as a tale of division, but as a testament to the power of compassion. Years passed, and the traveler grew older, but his message remained alive. He became a teacher, a voice for unity in a world often divided by fear and mistrust. And though he never saw the Samaritan again, he carried the man's kindness with him every day, a reminder that one act of love could ripple through generations. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, the traveler sat with his grandchildren gathered around him. They listened intently as he told the story of the man who had saved his life on the road to Jericho. "And what did you learn from the Samaritan, grandfather?" one of the children asked. The traveler smiled, his eyes shining with wisdom. "I learned that the world is not divided by borders or blood, but by the choices we make. I learned that kindness is not a weakness, but the greatest strength we possess. And most of all, I learned that love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds." The children nodded, their young hearts absorbing the lesson. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the traveler knew that the story of the Good Samaritan would live on, not just as a memory, but as a guiding light for all who sought to walk the path of compassion and redemption. And so, the journey that began on a treacherous road ended not with a single act of kindness, but with a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.